He was your member of provincial parliament, your finance minister, and your premier. He also happens to be Brampton's most famous resident. Known as Brampton Billy, the Honourable William Davis was born and raised in the city. After his successful law and later political career flourished, he stayed in Brampton. After graduating from the University of Toronto, he followed his father's footsteps, earning a law degree from Osgoode Hall. Participating in politics from an early age, he soon moved into the field himself. In 1959, he was elected into the Ontario Legislature and stayed in the provincial parliament till his retirement in 1985. For 14 of those years, he served as premier. Davis was a steady supporter of Ontario's education system and even created Ontario colleges. But his most recognized achievement was his cooperation with Prime Minister Trudeau in implementing the Canadian Charter of Rights. Join me, Veena Pandya, after the break as I go one-on-one with the Honourable William Davis. I'm Veena Pandya, and joining me on One is the Honourable William Davis. Welcome to One.
Pleasure to be here. More importantly, a pleasure to be with you.
Oh, well, I'm honored to have you here. Mr. Davis, really you are so well known as Brampton's most famous citizen. How does that make you feel?
It makes me feel very humble, and also makes me question the wisdom of my fellow Bramptonians.
Have you always been in Brampton?
I have been in Brampton now for 77 years, 3 months, and 10 days.
Well, that's quite a while.
And that's from day one I've been in Brampton, yes.
So you're a loyal Brampton citizen?
Yes.
Where did you go to school here in Brampton?
I went to Central Public School, where my principal was Harold Locken. Then I went to Brampton High School, and along with 3 or 4 others, we took a graduate year in grade 13, and we utilized that experience to defeat Runnymede Collegiate in football, which was the highlight of our athletic career at Brampton High School.
Well, would you say growing up, school was very important and education was very important to you?
It was fundamental. I mean, I still make speeches on the subject, as you know, that I use the trite phrase, it's not trite, it's true. Show me a good interviewer on cable television, a good doctor, a good lawyer. Some people say, are there any good lawyers? Show me somebody who has accomplished something, and I'll show you a good kindergarten teacher, a good elementary school, high school, or university. I mean, it's fundamental to the success of people individually, and it's fundamental to the success of the community, the province, and quite frankly, the country.
What sort of an upbringing did you have, family life?
A relatively strict upbringing. I had 2 sisters, both still with us. My father was a lawyer. He had had TB in his youth, or he might have gone into active politics, but he was the Crown Attorney for Peel for some 30 years.
Right.
And, but nonetheless had an interest. My mother was very involved with the church. We didn't play cards on Sunday. I went on the board of Seagram's, which you wouldn't know much about, being a teetotaler yourself, but I went on the board of Seagram's some few years ago, and I said to the then chairman, Mr. Bronfman, after a very warm welcome, I said, Mr. Bronfman, it's ironic, for the first time in the life of this board, you have welcomed the son of the former president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which my mother was. I mean, Brampton was a dry community for years. I grew up in that sort of environment.
Well, you went to University of Toronto, and after that you decided to pursue law. Why did you pursue law?
Well, I pursued law because for me it was a very easy decision.
Right.
My father was a lawyer. I didn't have any great, I think, engineering talents. I couldn't have passed math and physics like yourself. Far too hard for me. And I just knew from a very early stage I was going to practice law. And I think subconsciously I knew I probably was going to enter politics. My father was interested but couldn't take any positions. My mother was very interested in politics in the broad sense. So I grew up in an environment where, for me, law seemed quite logical, and ultimately political life.
Well, why did you get involved in politics at such a young age?
Well, I think it was once again environmental. When I say environmental, I lived in a household where politics was discussed. A very good friend of our family's was the Graydon family. I was at school with two of the daughters, and Gordon Graydon was the federal member for the Conservative Party, and he had me join the Young Conservatives. I guess I was about 15, 16. I was president, early secretary of the Senior Association, about 18, where Tom Kennedy, who was the provincial member, also was a friend of the family. So I grew up in an environment where both the federal member and the provincial member were interesting me in political life.
So your courtship started at a very young age and it continued on.
Yes, it started at a very early age. I mean, the reality is, very few people know this, my initial interest was running for the federal House because Gordon Graydon was the federal member.
Right.
He was much younger than Tom Kennedy. Under normal situations, Tom Kennedy would have passed on before Gordon Graydon. There was a friend of mine, John Pallett, who was senior to me, who wanted to run provincially. When Gordon Graydon died prematurely, John Pallett ran for the federal House and was successful. And so 2 or 3 years later, there was an opening. Tom Kennedy was going to retire, and so I ran provincially.
Well, that's where your saga starts.
Yes.
And after the break, we're going to continue on with the Honourable Bill Davis. Welcome back to One-on-One with the Honourable William Davis. Mr. Davis, you were first elected in 1959. Do you remember that election campaign?
Oh, I remember it very well. Actually, I had to go through the nomination process, which was in December of '58. I mean, the feeling was then that getting the nomination in Peel was tougher than winning the election. I mean, you had the history of Tom Kennedy as the member from, 1919 until '59. Very long time of service. He was out for 3 years, but we were successful in winning the nomination.
Well, you got the nomination, but the whole election campaign was not an easy one for you. Why was it such a difficult one?
Well, I discovered this great Tory organization in the county of Peel. Really, they were all friends of Tom Kennedy, which was fine, except he passed on in February. I couldn't stop that happening, but we were managing reasonably well. And then Mr. Diefenbaker, who was the Prime Minister of Canada, determined that the Arrow program at Avey Row would come to an end. And there were some 15,000 employees, a lot of whom lived in Brampton. I had the door slammed in my face in Malton, Brampton, Streetsville. My campaign manager and I went by the largest Liberal meeting I've ever seen in Brampton. Who was the guest speaker? The candidate? No. The leader? No. The guest was the test pilot for the Arrow.
Right.
It was very tight. We won by just a few hundred votes. And X years later, after a federal election took place where the federal member, Conservative, lost, John Pallett, John Hamilton, Conservative, lost in West York, and Sandy Best in Halton, The next provincial election, John lost by some 13,000. I won by some 14,000 the second go around because people had it out of their system.
So the stats were improving as time went along.
Well, Leslie Frost was forgiven the second time around. I went to see him in his office the day after the announcement, and I had always had Mr. Frost on a bit of a pedestal. I will not use the language he used on this program, but here I saw the Premier of Ontario speaking to our Prime Minister in language that I would have heard on a football field. He was so angry at Mr. Diefenbach. It was a very tough election.
Well, then from 1962 to, I believe, 1971, you were Minister of Education. What vision did you have for not just the region of Peel, but for Ontario and all its residents for education and post-secondary education in particular?
I'm not sure that I had a vision. I mean, I'm always suspicious of, I like people think they have visions. I like to see governments with a vision. I also like to see them with a plan of implementation. What I saw in the province was the growth that was taking place, the fundamental importance of education. And this is why for 9 years, it was sometimes 18 hours a day. And I had to come to understand that we had to increase the opportunities. And that's what led to the creation of the college system, because not everybody was going to university, too many were dropping out. We studied the system in several states of the Union, studied the junior college system in California, and came up with the system we have here, which I would not argue, I think I can say with some measure of confidence, probably now is the one that a lot of other jurisdictions look to. It's been extremely successful. And this was another opportunity for post-secondary education.
Well, you said during this time as Education Minister you were spending 18 hours a day, studying things, implementing things. How did you balance your family life at that point with young children?
Well, it was not easy. I did not make the mistake that some make of moving my family into the city. We stayed in Brampton. I also had a policy of coming home every night. Didn't always work, but nearly. And so we had communication first thing in the morning, which was not the best time for communication. And then time off in the summer. We would spend in Georgian Bay. The whole family would be there. And in spite of my absences during the day, you're always proud of certain accomplishments. I'm very proud of the accomplishment my wife had with the success of our 5 children.
Well, we'll hold it right there. And after the break, we'll continue on with the Honourable Bill Davis. Welcome back to One-on-One with the Honourable William Davis. Mr. Davis, you were Premier for a long time, 1971 to 1985.
Now, why do you say that's a long time?
Well,
I mean, it is in the
hey, you stayed at the top
thing.
of your game for a long time. That's something in politics here today. When you were in office at that time, what were some of the greatest challenges that you faced?
Well, I think one of the major challenges, was running a government, trying to maintain the stability, the economic health of the province. And as you may know, part of that tenure, we had what is called a minority government. I mean, we had great success in 71, 75 was fairly close, and as a result, we started having a minority. The polling figures looked pretty good in 77 on a leadership basis. We then had an election. We added about 4 or 5 seats, but we were still about 3, 4 short, whatever number. And so we had minority until 81. And so it was an exciting time because you could theoretically be defeated any day of the week that the House was sitting. But I think apart from wanting the economy to improve our social programs, educational programs, part of it related to the country. Ontario has historically, I think Ontario voters historically, have tended to put the national interest, I don't say ahead of, but in some respects more important than the provincial interest. And so we went through 2 or 3 periods in that length of time on the whole question of the patriation of the Constitution, the entrenchment of the Charter. I remember my first meeting in '71 in Victoria. The first ministers came to a decision. It was unanimous. Even Robert Bourassa, we had persuaded Trudeau to give a little bit on one of the programs, and Bourassa said to me, he said to others, I accept. Didn't get it in writing, didn't need to. 2 weeks later, Robert called and said, Bill, I just can't make it happen in Quebec. And so the unanimity was there. It was maybe a better amending formula in '71. And then we went through other iterations, and we got to the '81 period, and Trudeau had reached the point after 2 meetings of not threatening, but saying he might go to Westminster unilaterally. Mm-hmm. And I said, Mr. Prime Minister, I will not join you. I don't know what Hatfield will do, because there were just the 3 of us. And I said, you have to have one more meeting, one more chance. And we did that, '81, '82, and we were successful. Successful in that we got the patriation. We were now a nation of our own. We had a charter. We didn't have unanimity because Mr. Levesque said no, but the reality is it was perhaps one of the most important fundamental changes in the history of Canada.
Can you tell me, when you're in office, how does one handle critics?
Well, I learned fairly early, with the help of my mother and father, some friends, and my wife and children, that I knew what critics were. And I never ignored the critics, right. And I had some, but I had some who weren't critics too. I enjoyed my, shall we say, discussions with the press. They accused me of developing into a science the ability to answer questions in a manner they didn't understand. And I must confess that I had to work at being able to do that.
Is that a sign of a true politician?
No, it's a sign of one politician. I would never lead them astray, but I said to my cabinet colleagues, they can ask all the questions in the world, you can answer whatever you want to answer. And you know, you have to understand that the media is competitive, very competitive, right. Far more so today than when I was there. And they're there to elicit information, but they're also there perhaps to get either a byline in the paper or that 30 seconds on television, etc. They have their own interests. And I keep reminding people, acknowledge the fact they have their interests, but remember you have your interests, and that becomes more important in terms of your responsibilities.
Coming up after the break, I'll ask the Honourable Bill Davis if he ever considered running for federal politics. Welcome back to One-on-One with the Honourable William Davis. Mr. Davis, did you ever consider running for federal politics?
Now listen, do you think I should have?
I think you would have been great. So that's why I'm asking the question. I'd like to know.
I see. Well, I hope this tape will record that at least one person thought it would be a great idea. No, yes, I did think of it. A group of people had some polling done by Mr. Worthland in the States. He was the Republican poll. I knew nothing about it. And he did a poll across Canada to see how acceptable my involvement would be. And he found, even in Alberta, a fairly encouraging degree of acceptance. But then when they presented this to me, I said, fine. There had been a convention fairly recently with Mr. Clark. Mm-hmm. I said, what you have to do is to do a poll of the then delegates, because chances are they would be delegates at the next convention. And there, the figures were encouraging in Ontario and Quebec. They weren't as encouraging out west because there had been this ongoing debate for some years. So I said no. And then about 2 weeks later, about 30 people from Quebec, some from Montreal, all of whom were delegates, met me at the Park Plaza for breakfast. There were tears in the eyes because there was a recognition in Quebec what we had done in Ontario for the Francophone community, the school system, court system, and so on. And they kept saying, you're the only conservative who can win in Quebec. Came as a great shock and very flattering. So I weakened for about 24 hours, and then good sense prevailed, and I confirmed my decision. I was not going to be a candidate. I'd been in political life then for close to 25 years. I had not neglected, but I had missed the relationship with the family that I could have had. I now make up for it, but with the grandchildren. And I was not fluently bilingual. I remember going to this is a bit of an aside, to the first referendum in Montreal to speak to the Montreal Chamber. This was close to near the end of the first referendum. And so I spoke. My French was better than Diefenbaker's, but not great. René Lévesque called me the next morning. We were friends in spite of our major differences. He said, Bill, I hear you made a great speech. Will you come again soon? We went up 2 points in the polls last night. He had a great sense of humor. No, as I said at the outset of the program, my initial interest was in federal politics, but I found provincial politics very satisfying. And you can sometimes do more in terms of the people that you represent. So I thought about it, came close, but wisely said no.
You've retired, but yet you're still so loyal to Brampton, the city. Why is that?
Well, listen, I grew up here. I have a great affection for the city. I know still a number of people. I don't know the same percentage of people that I knew when I was 16, 17 years of age because of the growth. To me, it is the kind of city where I think we had good luck bringing up our children. I think it's still a good place for families. I think it's a good place in terms of employment opportunities. I might argue that we've grown a shade faster than the infrastructure has been made available, but I mean, that's another issue. And, you know, I sort of developed the habit of mentioning Brampton just about every other country of the world that I visited. Everybody knew where I came from. I'm not sure they all knew where Brampton was.
Well, you put it on the map. That's the important thing.
So I haven't discontinued that loyalty.
What do you do now with your time?
Now I still take an interest in politics. After I retired, I helped in a couple of federal campaigns, certainly in a couple of provincial. I've helped individual candidates. I have been on a number of boards that I found interesting, although they do have a bylaw, and a lot of them that you have to retire at 70. I nearly took a case under the charter saying the boards couldn't do that. They couldn't tell you to retire at 70. And I spent a lot of time with fundraising, philanthropic work. And of course now I actually get to say Ian's boys' hockey games. I get to graduations and so on. And I do a fair amount of speaking still, which is a mistake, but I still do.
Mr. Davis, it's been a pleasure to have you and an honor here on One-on-One, and we hope to see you back soon.
I'll be delighted to come back. Now, your definition of soon probably is 5 years from now. I hope to be able to.
Soon.
Soon, yes, okay.
That wraps up another episode of One-on-One. I hope to see you next time.